Annenberg Media.
Fluctuating exchange rates mean risk and uncertainty for governments and private businesses, tempting governments to try to manage currency markets. Managing currencies and policy coordination. How manageable are currency markets? We'll find out when we look inside the global economy.
In this segment of Inside the Global Economy, we're going to be talking about managing currencies and policy coordination. Why do countries do it? Has it been successful? We'll look at two case studies, one the Plaza Accord in 1985, and the second the experience of the UK joining the European monetary system to answer some of these questions. We'll also hear from a panel of experts who will address some of these issues. But first, why do countries manage their currencies? We've listed three reasons here. The first is to reduce the fluctuation in the currencies. And the reason for that is, obviously, if a currency is going to go up or down a lot, it can create serious problems for a country's exporters. It can create problems for its balance of payments. So the temptation on the part of a lot of governments is to try to reduce those fluctuations. A second reason is to reduce uncertainty. Again, it's very hard if you don't know where a currency is going, how far it's going to go up or down, to plan in the future, to make sensible decisions. So here again, governments are tempted to reduce the fluctuations in their currencies to make it easier for their businesses to plan ahead. And then finally, at least an argument in favor of managing currencies is to impose some kind of policy discipline. The logic here is that if a government, a central bank, is forced to maintain the currency within a narrow band, this imposes certain kinds of discipline in terms of, let's say, fighting inflation and so on. So all of these dictate that a country should manage its currencies rather than let it float completely freely. Now, let's step backward a little bit and look at the different kinds of exchange rate systems that exist currently around the world. And they're classified in two general areas. One, floating rate systems, and the other is pegged rate systems, which can cover either completely fixed exchange rates or fairly managed exchange rates. First of all, under floating exchange rates, and it's important to point out here that most exchange rates around the world do not float freely. There's some management that happens one way or another. But among these floating rate systems, there are three that we've identified. The first are independent floats, where a currency like the dollar or the yen will float against all currencies independently. So it may move one way against the yen, another way against the Deutschmark, and so forth. So this is one way in which currencies can float. Basically, they're going any which way against any number of currencies. A second is referred to as a group float, in which a group of countries agrees that the currencies and the exchange rates among their currencies are going to move on a very narrow band, but they'll float against all the currencies outside of the group. One example of this now is the European monetary system, the EMS, where at least up until 1993, most of these countries managed their exchange rates within a very narrow band, but then these currencies fluctuated widely against, let's say, the dollar or the yen. And finally, there's a third kind of a float, if you will, in which certain currencies will adjust according to certain kinds of formulas. It's like a formula float, where the formula can have the inflation rate in there, or interest rates, or GNP growth rates, or whatever, so that it's not floating every day, perhaps, but it is being adjusted according to a formula. Now, moving to peg rates, there are two basic kinds of peg rate systems, one in which a country will fix its exchange rates to one other currency, usually a key currency. For example, the Mexicans have in the past tied the peso to the dollar. So that's one example. There may be exchange rates being tied to other key currencies. For example, many of the African countries in the past have tied their currencies to the French franc, or it could be others as well. So this is what's referred to as a single currency peg. However, more and more these days, a lot of developing countries especially have tied their currencies to a basket of currencies. The one that's most prevalent is something called the SDR, the special drawing right. This is a basket put together by the International Monetary Fund. And what it does is it's a basket of currencies that includes the US dollar, the French franc, the British pound sterling, the German Deutschmark, and the Japanese yen. These are the big 5 currencies around the world. And so this way, by pegging to this group of currencies, there's less of a risk that you get tied to any one currency and suffer as a consequence of that. Now, other countries have put together other baskets of currencies that they want their exchange rates pegged against. But you can see from this diagram that there's a spectrum of ways that countries can manage their currencies and manage their exchange rate mechanisms. Let's look at some specific examples of how a country can manage its exchange rates. And we're looking here at the supply and demand of dollars in the German market. So this is the foreign exchange market in Germany, and it reflects the supply and demand for dollars in Germany. On the vertical axis, we have the price or the exchange rate, which is the number of marks per dollar. On the horizontal axis, we have the volume of dollars being bought and sold in the German foreign exchange market. It's in the hundreds of millions of dollars. And the lines here express the supply and demand for dollars in Germany. The supply curve, which slopes upward from the bottom left to the top right, expresses the supply of dollars in the market. And this supply reflects things like the desire of American tourists to go to Germany and spend their dollars in Germany. That increases the supply of dollars in Germany. Or, for example, of U.S. businesses buying goods in Germany, or U.S. consumers buying cars in Germany, what have you. That again means the supply of dollars in Germany is going up to buy those goods. On the demand side, we've got a downward sloping curve from the top left to the bottom right. This reflects the demand for dollars in Germany. It may be German tourists going to the U.S. They demand dollars to pay for their trip to the U.S. Or it could be German buyers of U.S. goods demanding dollars to pay for those goods. What we're showing in this graph is that the demand for dollars has increased. That's reflected by a rightward and an upward shift in the demand curve. This can come about, in our example, due to an increase in U.S. interest rates. As U.S. interest rates increase, the returns on U.S. assets go up on U.S. Treasury bills or bonds. And this means U.S. assets become more attractive, so the demand for U.S. assets goes up, and the demand for dollars to pay for those assets go up. So that is shown here in terms of that upward shift in the demand curve. And if the market for dollars was allowed to be free-floating in Germany, then the new equilibrium exchange rate would be, instead of 2 marks to the dollar, which was the original exchange rate, it would be 2.5 marks to the dollar. So this represents an appreciation of the dollar relative to the Deutschmark. So an increase in the demand for dollars because of higher interest rates leads to an increase in the value of the dollar relative to the Deutschmark. Now again, this is an example if the free-floating exchange market is allowed to function. What if the Federal Reserve, for example, decides that no, it does not want to let the value of the dollar go up. It doesn't want the dollar to appreciate in value. It wants to peg the value of the dollar at 2 Deutschmark per dollar. The way it can do this is to sell a large volume, in this instance $50 million a day worth of dollars in the German market, to satisfy that extra demand without increasing the value of the dollar relative to the Deutschmark. This is a perfectly feasible way to approach the fixing of exchange rates, especially the Deutschmark to the dollar, but it's also an expensive way to do it, because in this scheme, each day and every day, the Federal Reserve has to sell $50 million of dollars and buy 50 million in Deutschmark to maintain that fixed rate of the Deutschmark relative to the dollar. So feasible, yes, but expensive, certainly. So often what happens is that the Fed, or the central bank in question, tries to steer a middle course between perfectly floating exchange rates and perfectly fixed exchange rates. And these are referred to as managed floats. Sometimes they're referred to as dirty floats as well. Let's look at a different example to illustrate the same points. This is an example in which the supply of dollars has increased in Germany. This can come about as a result of, for example, an increase in U.S. GNP, an increase in U.S. incomes, which then translates into greater purchases on the part of U.S. consumers, which would include greater purchases of imported goods, let's say of BMWs and Mercedes. Well, to buy for those BMWs and Mercedes, the U.S. consumers would be paying dollars in Germany or exchanging their dollars for marks in Germany, which would increase the supply of dollars in Germany. This is represented by a downward and rightward shift in the supply curve. And if markets were completely free, if exchange rates were floating, then in fact the new exchange rate would be something below 1.5 Deutschmark to the dollar, as you can see in the graph. And that would be, if you will, the new equilibrium, the new floating market equilibrium for the dollar relative to the Deutschmark in the system. What if the Fed did not want the dollar to depreciate under these circumstances? Then its choice would be to buy dollars back, sell Deutschmark, to maintain the exchange rate at $2 Deutschmark to the dollars. It would be essentially buying about $50 million worth of dollars in the foreign exchange markets and selling the equivalent amount in Deutschmark. And that would be, it'd have to do that on a daily basis as long as it wanted to peg or support the value of the dollar at 2 Deutschmark to the dollar. Again, this can be a very expensive proposition, especially if it's kept up over a long period of time. So again, the Fed could choose a middle course, if you will, in which it would allow the dollar to depreciate a little bit, let's say to 1 3/4 Deutschmark to the dollar, but at the same time continue to intervene maybe to the tune of $30 million a day in terms of buying dollars, selling Deutschmark. And this, again, is sort of a middle course called a managed float. Sometimes it's referred to as a dirty float because you let it happen a little bit but not completely. Now, this raises the question of how do governments manage their currencies. The examples we showed before illustrated the first of these, which is a central bank can buy or sell currencies in the foreign exchange markets to try to stabilize or fix the value of its exchange rates. But more fundamentally, a government can actually change policies, its monetary policies, its credit policies, or its fiscal policies, which relate to spending and taxes, and they can have fundamental changes to the economy as a whole, which in turn translate into changes in the currency. And let's see if we can illustrate these with a series of flow diagrams. The first one shows how an expansionary fiscal policy, which is an increase in government spending or a decrease in taxes, translates into a change in the currency. The first, on the top part, is that greater spending on the part of the government increases GNP, which in turn means higher imports, which in turn means a worsening of the trade deficit. So that's the top part of the loop. The bottom part of the loop is as spending by the government increases, the financing needs of the government typically increase, so that pushes up interest rates. Now, what happens when interest rates increase is U.S. assets become more attractive worldwide, and that tends to mean money will actually flow into the U.S. The demand for dollars will increase around the world to pay for those more attractive assets. And that tends to offset a little bit the impact of the larger deficit, which is the top part of the loop. But the net effect of these two is to actually appreciate the value of the U.S. currency and to worsen the trade balance in the U.S. Now, what happens on the monetary policy front? What's the impact of a change in monetary policy in this environment? Well, in this instance, let's look at an increase in the money supply, which means easier credit, so interest rates decline. Again, this has two effects. On the top part of the loop, we have an increase in spending as interest rates decline. Credit is easier. This encourages housing activity. It encourages investment activity. It means an increase in GNP, an increase in imports, a worsening of the trade deficit. On the bottom part of the loop, Lower interest rates tend to mean that U.S. assets like treasury bills and bonds are less attractive now worldwide. So that means capital will now flow out of the U.S. and into foreign markets. So both of these effects, both the worsening of the trade deficit and this capital outflow, tend to bring about a depreciation of the U.S. currency. They work in the same direction, and in fact, that can eventually end up improving situations for the U.S. because as the currency depreciates, U.S. becomes more competitive, so the trade balance starts to improve, and so on. Now, as we look at these two examples of monetary and fiscal policy, this helps us to set the stage for the next case study that we're going to look at, in which in the mid-1980s, a combination of very expansive fiscal policy in the U.S. combined with very tight monetary policy brought about a very rapid and large appreciation of the dollar, which created a lot of problems for U.S. manufacturers and a lot of political tensions around the world. And let's see how the major governments around the world sought to resolve this problem.
International currency markets. Trillions of dollars, yen, Deutschmarks, and other world currencies changing hands each day. Currency values floating up or down on the currents of supply and demand. Could nations and businesses that base their economic plans on exchange rates live with the fluctuations of market-driven exchange rates? And if they couldn't, was there any way the market could be managed? In the early 80s, the U.S. dollar floated high against the Japanese yen and German Deutschmark, buoyed by the Reagan-era combination of tight money and a high budget deficit. That was good news for Japan and Germany, because the high dollar meant a low yen and Deutschmark and low prices for Japanese and German exports, more sales, and more jobs. But the high dollar was bad news for the U.S. Higher export prices, declining sales, lost jobs, and calls for government protection. As Ronald Reagan's Treasury Secretary, James Baker believed that free markets made their best choices without government interference. But as a practical politician, he knew what would happen if the government failed to act.
The United States was facing a real prairie fire of protectionism. There was a lot of protectionist sentiment in the Congress. Legislation was being discussed, if not introduced, and it was our view that something had to be done about that.
To head off the threatened protectionism, Baker picked New York's Plaza Hotel as the site for secret monetary diplomacy. A 1985 gathering of finance ministers and central bankers from the G5, the big industrial nations. Their surprise decision, the Plaza Accord, an agreement to sell dollars on worldwide currency markets in an effort to send the dollar and American export prices down. Why would Germany and Japan be willing to give up the advantages of the low Deutschmark and yen? Finance Minister Gerhard Stoltenberg represented Germany at the Plaza.
Maybe a short-term advantages could be endangered when the other important countries, in this case especially United States, would be negatively affected, especially by a expanding trade deficit which created tensions also for the other countries. So we wanted a surplus in trade, but not as big as we had when the dollar was more than 3 Deutschmark.
Toyo Giyoten was Japan's Vice Minister of Finance at the Plaza.
Strong dollar made Japanese exports very easy, and very large Japanese surplus generated international criticism against Japan. Japan was concerned about those criticisms.
The Plaza Accord put the G5 back into the international exchange rate equation. Had they abandoned the policy of market-driven exchange rates?
Well, it was essentially a policy change, even though at the time we probably disclaimed the idea that it was a big policy change.
The dollar had been dropping, and now it dropped faster, down a record 4.29% the day after the Plaza, down almost 55% a year later against the yen. Had the new strategy worked? MIT professor Paul Krugman.
All the evidence before and since has suggested that intervention on the scale that actually took place should not have made very much difference. The usual experience has been that an intervention of the size, a few $1 billion, that took place after the Plaza Accord is something, if the market doesn't agree, the market thinks the dollar should be going up and you intervene to try to force it down, the market can swallow $20 billion of intervention with just a slight burp and then continue on its progress. So the intervention itself probably isn't the explanation. There's a second view, which some people call the slap-in-the-face theory, which was that the market was going crazy and the Plaza Accord, all these dignified finance ministers got together and said, the dollar is too high, it really should be going down, and the market sort of went, thanks, I needed that, and the dollar started to fall instead.
The dollar kept falling, and the finance ministers and central bankers were satisfied. But for businesses who had based corporate strategies on the high dollar, the dollar's drop made their plans obsolete. 17 months after the Plaza Accord, at the Louvre in Paris, Secretary Baker persuaded America's allies to try to keep the dollar from falling any further. Why would the U.S. want to intervene again in the exchange rate market?
Those people who believe in free markets and in laissez-faire, as indeed I do as an economic philosophy, want to see stable exchange rates. And this exercise was an exercise in trying to improve the stability of exchange rates.
But the dollar, far from stabilizing, kept falling. Had the manager's attempt at intervention failed? Had the Plaza strategy reached a dead end? Secretary Baker said no.
You see, I did not see and do not see the Plaza as strictly an intervention exercise or a currency exercise. What I see it as and saw it as was the beginning of a process of policy coordination among the major economies in the world, major industrial democracies.
The Plaza and Louvre meetings did trigger a series of economic summits and policy coordination conferences. But how much coordination was actually taking place?
Countries were very willing to send their finance ministers, their secretaries of the Treasury, to nice places, to have ceremonial meetings, and promised that all sorts of good things would happen. But none of the major countries was willing, it turns out, to change any basic policies as part of a consultative process. Over time, these meetings have become meetings at which the countries declare that they would like to have good things happen and that they believe that the policies they're already following are the right way to make those good things happen.
Heads of state and finance ministers still met. But their efforts at market management seemed to work only when they leaned with the wind. When they tried to lean against the wind to turn the market around, the wind won.
Was the Plaza Accord successful? Let's go back to Melbourne, Australia, where my colleagues and I discussed this some time ago. They include Rachel McCullough of Brandeis University, Hervé Torres of the International Monetary Fund, and Richard Snape of Monash University in Australia. Let's see how the discussion went.
Rachel, can exchange rates get stuck at the wrong level?
Well, it's not always easy to say what the right level is. With a market-determined exchange rate, as we've had more or less since 1973 for the dollar, the market equates all supply with all demand, and that includes the supply and demand in the asset market, which are often much larger than the supply and demand for currencies that arise from trading goods. But the story of the United States in the first half of the 1980s was that the dollar was becoming very, very strong relative to virtually every currency. And it was increasingly viewed to be wrong in the sense that the strong dollar was out of line with money, dollar costs of production in the United States. So that in many U.S. manufacturing industries where U.S. producers competed with firms in Japan or in Europe or elsewhere around the world in the newly industrializing countries, et cetera, it became harder and harder for the U.S. producers to lose their own, to hold their own in those markets. They were beginning to lose market share not only in the standardized manufacturing industries where U.S. producers were somewhat on a par with producers in other countries, but even in the very high-tech sectors where the U.S. had the clearest comparative advantage. And so as that became increasingly clear, the U.S. Congress wanted to do something. Protectionism was very much in the wind. And so although the Reagan administration was committed to a free market policy for exchange rates, it decided to do something about it, and hence the Plaza meeting.
But how is it that exchange rates can so badly misread the economic factors within that country?
Now, it wasn't that the market got it, in a sense, wrong. The market got it right. What was wrong was that disjunction of government policies as compared. And what the Plaza Accord and later the Louvre Accord were trying to do was to introduce a greater coordination of government policies so that they would come closer together, so you wouldn't get one group of countries running tight monetary policy but loose fiscal policy, and the other group of countries doing the opposite. And that was an attempt to bring that coordination at those meetings, and where we see that the market reacted to this. It was the market reacting really to a signal that these governments were going to try and coordinate their policies more.
And that is better, do you believe, than direct intervention?
I think it is better, much better. What Richard has said is that as the economy becomes more and more integrated, what one country does or does not affects other countries, and because of that, I need not only to have my economic policies in place, sound macroeconomic policies, but I also need that my main trading partners have their own economic policies in place. For example, if a country, any particular country, is running an important fiscal deficit, this fiscal deficit may be compensated by high interest rate. But this high interest rate make economic agent to move to that country to take the opportunity of that high interest rate. So it may oblige me to keep or to maintain high interest rate. But nobody wants high interest rate, because high interest rate means an increasing cost for real economic activity. So I may be obliged to have a high interest rate, which means to pose a burden on my economic real activity, just because another country with which I have economic relation has an important fiscal deficit. So now this is, I could say, this is part of the disadvantage also of a more integrated world economy. What others do affects me in a very direct way.
Eva, thank you.
Let's summarize the role of domestic U.S. policy in the fluctuations of the dollar in the mid-1980s. To begin with, we had very expansive fiscal policy and very restrictive monetary policy, the net result of which was very high interest rates in the U.S. This attracted a lot of capital, foreign capital, into the U.S., increased the demand for dollars, and raised the value of the U.S. exchange rate relative to a lot of other currencies. In turn, what that did was to make U.S. goods much more uncompetitive in the world economy, which worsened the U.S. trade deficit. Now, eventually, that large trade deficit was one of the contributing factors that helped to bring the value of the dollar down. But in some ways, more importantly, or as important, was the role of policy coordination, as we saw in the case study. Let's see if we can illustrate the importance of policy coordination in this example. Here we're looking at the interaction between U.S. monetary policy and German monetary policy. So one of the things that could be done in a situation where the value of the dollar is too high relative to the German mark is the U.S. can stimulate monetary policy, lower its interest rates. Germany can restrict its monetary policy, raise its interest rates. And the lower rate on U.S. assets, but the higher rate on German assets, means that the demand for U.S. assets will go down, the demand for German assets will go up. That will weaken the demand for dollars, strengthen the demand for Deutschmark, so the dollar will depreciate. Vice versa, if we're trying to strengthen the dollar, if the dollar is too weak, then U.S. monetary policy can tighten, U.S. interest rates go up, German monetary policy can loosen, German rates go down, and so the net effect of both of those is to attract money into dollar-denominated assets. The point, though, that's really important here is that the combined efforts of the two central banks, the Federal Reserve and the Bundesbank, are more powerful than each of them acting alone. And together they can pool their resources, and each of them doesn't have to expend as much effort and energy into reaching the same goal, provided, of course, they agree on the goal. Which brings us to the benefits of policy coordination. There are a number of them. We've listed three here. And the first one we just illustrated, but it's worth reinforcing, and that is that policy coordination is much more effective than a piecemeal approach. It works best if you're both trying to do the same thing together. You share resources. The impact can be much, much stronger if you're both pushing in the same direction. Second is policy coordination ensures the compatibility of policies in various countries. If you sit down and talk about where are we trying to go, what are we trying to do, clearly the resulting policies have the better chance of being compatible in the sense that you've at least talked it through and agree which direction you're trying to push it, whether it's to get the dollar down or up. And finally, from a political perspective, a united approach to policy makes it easier sometimes to sell painful policy choices. For example, in the mid-1980s, the U.S. had to cut its budget deficit. It had to cut its spending. It had to increase taxes. And this was easily, or more easy, I should say, to sell in the context of international policy coordination. So this international context gave U.S. politicians some cover to make some of these painful choices. So all of these suggest the reasons why policy coordination can, in fact, be quite beneficial. Let's look at some of the institutions around the world that have helped in the process of policy coordination and have made the coordination of exchange rates easier. First and foremost is the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF, which was set up at the end of World War II under the Bretton Woods Agreement. Both in its early stages and more recently, the function, one of the most important functions of the IMF has been to help countries stabilize their exchange rates and their balance of payments problems. And by and large, it has been quite successful in doing that. Another institution is the so-called Group of Seven, or G7, although sometimes it's the Group of Three, G3, or G10. But this is a group that gets together a number of times in the year and at least once a year in a very high visibility summit somewhere around the world. And the heads of these countries, usually the prime ministers and presidents of these countries, often get together to agree on some basic goals. Now, not always successfully, but again, it's better that they meet, and sometimes they have had some success in focusing on the kind of goals that they would like to all achieve mutually. So again, a limited success in terms of this particular institution. Third is an institution called the Bank for International Settlements, or the BIS. This is a bank that's located in Basel, Switzerland, and it's like a clearinghouse for the central banks around the world. However, it also has an important function in the sense that it brings together the central bankers, and they can at least discuss and talk and coordinate some of their policies. There are also smaller, more regional institutions, like the European Monetary System, or the EMS, that bring about coordination among a smaller group of countries and more management of currencies. And until 1993, under the EMS, many of the European countries fixed their exchange rates within a very narrow band. To see how this worked and the benefits that came about from this policy coordination, and also some of the downsides of the policy coordination and managing of currencies, Let's look at a case study of the United Kingdom joining the EMS in the early 1990s.
Europe features a colorful collection of national currencies whose exchange rates rise and fall against each other. This results, economically speaking, in uncertainty.
Ja, dankjewel.
The European Community started in 1979 with the exchange rate mechanism of the European monetary system. Wim Duisenberg, president of the Central Dutch Bank.
But the agreement implies that countries make an effort, and a serious effort, to converge in their economic development, including inflation rates, so that exchange rates can remain stable.
But how do the central banks manage to keep interest rates on the different currencies stable?
Well, in effect, exchange rates are prices. It is the price of one currency expressed in terms of another currency. And the price of money is interest. And the interest rates can be manipulated by central banks. And the other thing is the quantity. So central banks can manipulate both the price of money and the quantity of money traded into each other, that we call interventions in the exchange markets.
When inflation is beaten, and it will be, Britain will be stronger still.
Under Margaret Thatcher's leadership, the British government remained for years a strong opponent of participation in the ERM. Interest rates were raised in order to defend the pound. Inflation in England was 8% in 1990, with interest rates of 15%. Many homeowners were forced to sell their homes because of problems with these rates. Unemployment and bankruptcies rose dramatically. Margaret Thatcher gave in. Sir Alan Walters was Margaret Thatcher's advisor.
And the political pressure to go into the ERM was enormous. I don't think it was much to do with the ERM as such. It was more to do with personalities in the Conservative Party. But that's another matter.
The British government hoped that entering the ERM would help interest rates and inflation rates decrease. Karl Otto Pohl, former president of the Central German Bank.
I told that John Major at that time, he called me and informed me that they wanted to join the ERM at 2.95. And I said, look, we have to negotiate that. This is not a unilateral decision. It needs two for tango, because we are on the other side. And he said, no, that is already decided, and the Prime Minister has decided. I said, well, that is not my Prime Minister, but we couldn't do anything because it was published in London. And so it was in the market, and so we couldn't say, well, we think that's the wrong rate.
It was actually the rate at which the pound was being traded at that moment. So I wouldn't say it was the wrong rate. But and in that period and the ensuing years, particularly inflation and wage developments in the United Kingdom were very much higher, although gradually less high, but very much higher than in the other countries of the European Community.
In the same month that the pound entered the ERM, the unification of Germany took place. The core country of the ERM started to push up its interest rates, forcing all members to follow. But keeping the pound unaltered in the ERM became a question of political prestige in London. In 1992, the finance ministers of the European Community met in the English city of Bath. Given the high inflation, Germany required England to devaluate the pound. England demanded Germany to decrease its interest rate. It didn't want to devaluate, neither to increase the interest rate. The financial markets, speculators, institutional investors and companies trying to hedge their risks alike started unprecedented speculation against the pound.
Fundamentally, they attack a currency by selling that currency and moving out of that currency. And that's not pure gnomes or speculators, very responsible companies, I always say, which operate internationally, have to see to it that the value of their cash tomorrow is at least the same as what it is today or over the weekend.
Speculation against the British pound reached billions. Speculators took advantage of the weakness of the ERM, that only a currency in crisis could be devalued. One such speculator was George Soros.
The money that I made on this particular transaction, the estimate is about $1 billion. You very simply use the forward market. You borrow sterling and you sell the sterling that you have borrowed, you see, and then you buy back the sterling when the loan expires.
Well, the amounts that were required to keep the pound within the limits that had been agreed upon, so by buying up the pound, were so enormous that the authorities, in order to have the currencies with which to buy pounds available, had to borrow enormous amounts from other central banks, particularly in this case the Bundesbank. And then you're talking about tens and tens of billions of D-mark, which have to be borrowed, and that in the end that becomes unsustainable.
Finally, on the 16th of September 1992, the situation reached breaking point. England's Black Wednesday.
The government has concluded that Britain's best interests are served by suspending our membership of the exchange rate mechanism.
Question is the motion on the order paper. Mr. John Smith to move the amendment.
The real lesson, Madam Speaker, to be drawn from a comparison of the British and German economies is that before you can have a strong currency, you need a strong economy.
For the British taxpayer, the costs of the short-lived experiment with a fixed currency had been extremely expensive.
So what went wrong when Britain joined the EMS? Let's go back to Melbourne, Australia, and see what our panelists have to say about this.
How did the exchange rate mechanism work?
Well, the European members of the exchange rate mechanism all agreed that their currencies would fluctuate in a very, very narrow band against each other. And they could make that happen in one of two ways. One, they could intervene directly in the foreign exchange markets. In the case of the UK, as the pound was beginning to devalue, what the Bank of England did was to buy pounds, sell other currencies to try to shore it up, or shore up the value of the pound. Or there's a second way in which, through monetary and fiscal policy, they could do the same thing. And in fact, again, the British did that by raising interest rates. And so, using either of those methods, they could make sure that the currency remained in that tight band.
Richard, why fix one exchange rate to another?
I think there are two reasons. The first reason is an attempt to reduce uncertainty. That is, to give the confidence of a fixed exchange rate when transacting and to make it easier for transactors in that way. Second reason is to try and discipline a country's own domestic policies. Thus, a small country may fix the value of its currency in relation to a large, stable country. The reason being then that its own domestic fiscal and monetary policies have to be keyed very closely to those of that bigger country, or else the fixed exchange rate won't be sustainable.
It really gives different directions in which a country can go in deciding to what should the currency be pegged. If the goal is to reduce uncertainty in trade, then the country will want to peg to the currency of an important trading partner so that the maximum amount of trade is affected in that way. So, for example, former colonies of France are likely to peg to the franc. Former colonies and Commonwealth members may be pegging to the pound sterling, even though those currencies in other respects might not be ideal. when the goal is to constrain macroeconomic policy and to give credibility, in particular, to a new anti-inflation package, for example, then the currency to peg to would be a currency that has a very good inflation experience. And the predominant choice would be the mark, because Germany is famous for its desire to keep inflation low at almost any cost.
Of course, the irony in this experience is that just as the UK pegged its exchange rate to the Deutschmark was when German unification happened. Germany went through this very sort of super Reaganomics kinds of policy. Inflation started to rise in Germany. So that very anchor sort of started to drift, and creating huge problems for the other members of the exchange rate mechanism in Europe, especially the UK, forcing them to raise their interest rates at a time when their economies were very weak, and eventually it all unraveled.
So what is the harmful consequences, or what are the harmful consequences of speculation when it comes to this sort of fixing interest rate, exchange rates?
Well, governments like to blame speculators for producing strong fluctuations in their exchange rate. Speculators are people who are buying or selling different currencies, and the question is whether they are provoking this fluctuation or they are anticipating them. And I believe that what the so-called speculators do is usually to anticipate in what direction the market is moving. So, of course, by doing that, they may accelerate what the market finally is going to do. But the point is that if a government is, as we have said here before, is running, for example, a very high deficit, and its exchange rate is not viable or is not sustainable at the level in which it is, no matter whether there are not or there are not speculators, it is going to, this exchange rate is going to change or to collapse.
Mm. The circumstances as occurred in the UK in 1992 create what is basically a one-way bet, because what the markets realized was that the UK could not, number one, didn't have enough foreign exchange reserves to prop up the pound that way, and politically couldn't keep their interest rates very high. So they all bet that sooner or later the pound was going to devalue, and they started to sell pounds in a massive way. And indeed, they anticipated, as Herbert was saying, the direction that the pound took.
So sometimes what government should do maybe is to follow what the speculators are doing.
Otherwise, the speculators make money at their expense.
Certainly
exactly.
at the expense of the government, yes.
Exactly.
Mm.
And these wicked speculators are not only the people who get into the headlines, but it's everyone.
Mm.
Anyone who might be travelling would not retain pound sterling in their pocket for very long at that time. Anyone who is in fact trading would either try to pay very quickly or else defer payment, depending on which way it is.
Yes.
In the case of England, they lost $10 billion in one day. And then the question after that is, was there a need for the country to lose $10 billion? Who have benefit from that loss? And 1 or 2 days earlier, they had said that they were not to devalue the currency, and they finally had to do it.
We all know that the louder they say we're not going to do it, the more that people can be sure they are going to do it. Yeah. And Britain has got an unfortunate record in this, because that was in 1992 this occurred. It was 1967, exactly the same sort of story went on. Devaluation is defeat, they said then. They said, we will never be defeated.
So
But
other than going with the flow of speculators, how can you then deal with speculators and the effect that they might have on the market?
You try not to set up the circumstances when speculation has a one-way bet, because everyone in the world who can be will become a speculator in those circumstances. And you avoid that situation by getting into circumstances where you're trying to defend the indefensible. Mm. And so it's really time and time again when we talk about exchange rates, we get back to basic policies and say, what about the policies that are lying behind? That is the policies, that the monetary policies of governments and the budgetary policies of governments in particular, that they're what really lie behind. So often the exchange rates And the speculators are simply the messengers of what is happening underneath. And it's what's underneath that's important.
So do we come back to domestic policy as being still the best policy in terms of managing interest rate, exchange rates?
But we may come back to the fact that in today's financial markets, it's increasingly difficult to get the gains of fixed exchange rates because we have so many more vehicles by which private sector individuals can exercise their view that the exchange rate is out of line. And if we go back to 1973 and the reason why the industrialized countries did not succeed in gluing back together the pieces of the old Bretton Woods system of pegged exchange rates, it was ultimately because they wanted to be freer in changing their fiscal and monetary mix to suit changing circumstances. And if they then change the exchange rate each time they want to change the underlying macro policies, they lose most of the benefits of a fixed exchange rate.
And in fact, that's exactly what happened in the UK. Monetary policy in the UK was basically handcuffed to monetary policy in Germany. Every time Germany raised its interest rates, the UK had to, even though for domestic reasons there's no reason to raise interest rates. The UK was in a recession at the time, which is exactly the point that Rachel's making.
Nariman, thank you.
Let's see if we can summarize what happened in this case study and the discussion. To begin with, Germany had very high interest rates in the early 1990s as a result of its unification process. And because of the rigid structure of the European monetary system and exchange rates, Britain had to keep its interest rates very high, even though it was in the midst of a recession. So by the summer of 1992, financial markets were betting that, in fact, the UK would have to lower its interest rates in order to relieve its recession. And as this happened, a lot of speculators started to sell the pound sterling in a big way and buy Deutsche Mark. As it tried to fix the exchange rate or keep the exchange rate fixed, the Bank of England, the Central Bank of England, was buying pound sterling, selling Deutsche Mark to offset these speculative waves. And it just couldn't keep that up. It couldn't keep up with the volume of the selling that was going on of the pound in the world exchange markets, as basically everybody was betting that eventually the pound would be devalued. And so sooner or later the dam broke, and in fact the UK government left the EMS, and the pound sterling was devalued, as it turns out. There's an interesting footnote here, and that's a year later, in August of 1993, the whole system broke apart, and many of the other governments left it, at least temporarily. So let's look at what are some of the problems with policy coordination, some of which have been illustrated by our case study. To begin with, we've listed 5 problems here. First, there can be different or inconsistent policy goals. For example, in the case study we just saw, Germany needed high interest rates to finance its unification, whereas the UK needed low interest rates because it was at the bottom of a recession. So again, there was an inconsistency there. Second, there can be different national institutions and political climates. Traditionally, the Germans have been very aggressive about keeping inflation low, whereas the British have been more relaxed about inflation, more permissive in terms of inflation. So again, there was a disconnect there. Third, 2 countries can be in different phases of their business cycle. For example, in 1992, the UK was at the bottom of its recession, whereas Germany had barely peaked. So again, they needed different kinds of policies because they were in different places. Fourth, there can be disputes over the gains or burden sharing of policy coordination. The question in this example was, who was to blame? Who was going to come to the rescue? Whose fault it was? And so those kinds of disputes can create problems for policy coordination. And finally, there are financial limits. In the example we saw, there was only so much in the way of foreign reserves that the UK government had to be able to maintain fixed exchange rates with a Deutsche Mark. So again, there are limits to policy coordination based on finances alone. Now, where does all this leave us in terms of policy coordination and managing currencies? Clearly, managing currencies have been difficult under the best of circumstances. And also the experience suggests that policy coordination has had some difficulties in the past. However, one thing is clear, that you can't do the first, manage currencies, without coordinating policies. If you try, you're doomed to failure. For Inside the Global Economy, this is Nariman Barabash.
Annenberg Media. For information about this and other Annenberg Media programs, call 1-800-LEARNER and visit us at www.learner.org.